In 1950, television company CBS approached Lucille Ball about starring in a television show based off her wildly successful radio program, My Favorite Husband. The studio envisioned Ball working on the show with her radio co-star at the time, actor Richard Denning. However, Lucy demurred the request in favor of casting her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, on the show instead. CBS was convinced the American public would never accept the premise and initially refused the concept. As history will show, however, The I Love Lucy show, starring Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, was and still is a beloved part of American television history and a much deserving subject of our top 10 list today. The lovable landlords and best friends of the Ricardos were Fred and Ethel Mertz, played by William Frawley and Vivian Vance. Casting for these roles, however, was not so simple. William Frawley was born in 1887 in Burlington, Iowa. By the time Desi and Lucy were looking for an actor to fill the role of Fred Mertz, Frawley had over 100 film credits to his name. However, as Frawley was now in his mid-60s, regular parts were becoming harder to secure. He was eager to have a chance at getting cast in the new show. After submitting his initial interest, he called Lucille Ball directly to ask what his chances would be. Despite Ricky and Lucy being enthusiastic about the prospect of such an experienced actor taking the part, CBS was less excited. Frawley had an industry reputation for drinking and unreliability. Arnaz decided to give Frawley a chance, but with severe stipulations. Frawley could never arrive at work drunk or miss a workday for anything other than a legitimate illness more than once. Frawley was more than eager to comply and throughout the filming never violated these conditions. Arnaz and Frawley eventually became very close friends. Vivian Vance was born in 1909 in Cherryvale, Kansas. Vance was working primarily in theater when Lucy and Desi began casting for the show, and it was director Mark Daniels who suggested she would fit the part perfectly. Originally, Lucy was very keen on casting either Bea Benaderet or Barbara Pepper in this role, both of whom were her close friends in real life. But Bea was already committed to another production, and Barbara was rejected by CBS due to her drinking problems, although both would have guest appearances throughout the series' run. Desi went to go see Vivian on stage and agreed she would play the part spectacularly. Unfortunately, Lucy was pregnant during this time and was unable to attend with them. Desi was ready to offer Vance the role, but Lucy was not happy with his choice. She perceived Vivian Vance to be too much of a quote-unquote glamour girl, and Lucy, who was notoriously vain both on and off air, did not want a competing beauty on the set. One of her first remarks to Vivian was, "You don't look like a landlady." Vivian herself was unsure of the part as well. She knew it meant playing a drab older woman and wasn't sure she was interested. However, eventually she came around on the prospects and was able to convince Lucy that she could drab up appropriately for the part. The biggest issue throughout the series' run was the friction between Frawley and Vance off-screen. They absolutely hated each other. Hollywood legend has it that Vance made a very loud and public insult about how old Frawley was and how unbelievable it would be for them to depict a married couple. Allegedly, Frawley never forgave her for the comment. Further Hollywood lore is that when Vance heard of Frawley passing several years later, she celebrated with a bottle of champagne. Lucy and Desi met in 1940 while working on a Broadway musical. It was 11 years before they decided to produce the show. However, they met hurdles with CBS, who didn't believe America would accept a mixed-race marriage. Originally, CBS wanted to cast another actor named Richard Denning for the part, as the show was based on Lucy's intensely popular radio show at the time, My Favorite Husband. Lucy and Desi were sure the premise would work, so they developed a vaudeville show to prove it to CBS. They premiered the act at the Newburgh, New York Ritz Theater with Desi's orchestra. The act was a hit, and CBS approved production with Desi and Lucy starring in the lead roles. The show was difficult to find a sponsor for, but was at last picked up by cigarette giant Philip Morris. As the big sponsor, they had a significant influence on the show's production and made some artistic calls, such as setting the show in New York City instead of LA. In addition, lots of smoking was featured in each episode, and the name Philip Morris was worked into the dialogue whenever plausible. There was, however, one small problem. Lucille Ball was a Chesterfield girl. She eventually overcame this little hurdle by having a stagehand stuff any on-camera Philip Morris packs full of Chesterfield cigarettes. Arnaz listed his height as 5'11" in most official biographies, but those who worked with him knew that in reality he was closer to 5'9" and wore 4-inch lifts in his shoes. Lucille Ball was a tall woman, coming in at almost 5'7" in her stocking feet, and when she wore heels, she seemed to tower over her husband. Desi Arnaz Jr. would later explain to an interviewer that his father was a Cuban with a Latin male's pride, which is why it was important to him to be taller than his wife. A dual-purpose, subtle, additional cushion, undetectable by the viewing audience, was added to the Ricardo's love seat so that Desi would be taller than Lucy while seated. This also gave him an extra boost up to compensate for the 4-inch lifts in his shoes. A running gag throughout the show is that Ricky's thick Cuban accent made it difficult for his English-only speaking friends to understand him. However, if you notice, only Lucy could make jokes at Ricky's expense about his thick Cuban accent. Although this was not an official rule, it was an unwritten rule among the cast and crew. Also, when subtle jokes were written in where other actors made fun of his accent, the audience did not respond. It was usually perceived as cruel rather than a loving tease if the jokes came from anybody else but Lucy. Job switching, often referred to as the Candy Factory episode, has long been a fan favorite, particularly the scene where Lucy and Ethel are stuffing their faces and clothing with chocolates while trying to keep up with a speedy conveyor belt. The previous scene features Lucy hand-dipping chocolates with a real-life candy dipper that stage manager Herb Brower found at See's Candies on Santa Monica Boulevard. Amanda Milligan had never seen I Love Lucy. She watched wrestling on Monday nights instead. But Brower hired her anyway. He thought her deadpan expression would make her the perfect straight woman for Lucille to react to. During rehearsals, Lucille worried that the scene wasn't going to be funny on film because Milligan seemed hesitant to hit her on the face as the script specified. When cameras were rolling, Milligan hauled off and smacked Lucille so hard that Ball felt her nose had been broken. Despite her pain and ringing in her ears, Ball didn't call for a cut because she didn't want to have to do another take. During a break in filming, Lucille asked Milligan, "So how did you like working in show business?" An unsmiling Milligan, who'd spent 8 hours per day for the past 30 years putting swirls on chocolates, replied, "I've never been so bored in my life." Although pregnancies on TV are commonplace now, there was a time when it was considered absolutely taboo. Back in the puritanical 50s, pregnancy was seen as far too scandalous for television. In fact, even including the word pregnant was an issue. But with Lucy being pregnant in real life, she couldn't hide it in public, let alone on screen. CBS eventually agreed to write the pregnancy into the script, but Desi made sure they were in safe hands. As a solution, Desi hired a minister, a rabbi, and a priest to sit in during the writing process to make sure the writers didn't accidentally offend anyone. On the show, her wardrobe throughout her pregnancy was very loose to minimize its overall appearance. This is a far cry from TV series today, which depict pregnancy in a much more positive light. In the episode where Lucy gave birth to little Ricky, 73.9% of homes in America were tuned in to watch, which equaled about 44 million viewers, a record unbroken until Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. Like many sitcoms before and after it, I Love Lucy was filmed in front of a live audience at CBS's studios in Los Angeles. Most of the laughs heard on the show are from real audience members, not a recorded laugh track. What's worth noting is that die-hard fans may recognize one fan's voice more than the others. As it turns out, Lucille's mom, Dee Dee, came to most of the filmings, and her reaction was usually the trademark, "uh-oh," when something extreme happened. Also worth noting is the fact that you can hear Desi's laugh throughout many episodes as he watched from the sidelines. The 3-camera format for filming a television show is used commonly today, but it first found its origins in I Love Lucy when they began developing the show, and the main stars of it, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, wanted to film in California as opposed to New York, which was common during that time. Philip Morris objected to this because their biggest market was on the East Coast and they wanted the highest quality picture there. To overcome the fact that there was limited range for live television broadcasts, they would frequently use kinescope technology for shows that were filmed in New York and then shipped to distant markets. The problem was this created a reduced picture quality. Desi Arnaz suggested that the show be filmed with 3 multi-cameras, which had never been used in a situational comedy before, and there were many obstacles involved, not the least of which was accommodating a live studio audience, because Desi knew that Lucille worked best when she got immediate audience feedback. Desi hired legendary cinematographer Carl Freund to help solve the dilemma, and along with writer-producer Jess Oppenheimer and director Mark Daniels, they built a set, and the necessary filming equipment was strategically placed. The 3-camera format also meant the audience did not need to react to the same scene multiple times when the show was being filmed. The use of 3 cameras allowed them to shoot the scenes in sequence from 3 different shots at the same time. CBS balked at the additional expense involved in this undertaking, so Arnaz struck a deal. He and Lucy would take a large cut in their salaries, and the company, Desilu Productions, would retain ownership of the films in exchange. The enduring high quality of the 35mm film was part of the reason that I Love Lucy became so popular in rerun syndication, and Desilu's 100% ownership of the series made Lucille and Desi the first millionaire TV stars. It's well known that Lucy and Desi eventually divorced. What is not so common knowledge is the fact that the first time Lucy filed for divorce was in 1944, 7 years before the premiere of the I Love Lucy show. This was the result of stress on the marriage due to multiple miscarriages, Desi's alleged drinking, and infidelity. They reconciled before the final papers were filed. Despite the depiction as America's sweethearts throughout the series, their relationship continued to decline. This was added to the pressures of running a major production company together. And despite his promises to the contrary, Desi's infidelities continued to strain their marriage as well. Despite their angry divorce, they continued to work together when Lucy returned to the air with The Lucy Show, which Desi produced for 15 episodes. They continued to run Desilu Studios together until Lucy eventually bought Desi out for $2.5 million. Lucy became the first female CEO of a major company until she sold it in 1967 for $17.5 million.